today. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Bitzinger to be the first speaker. So you have the floor, please.
Yeah, I'm just going to sit here because I'm too tired. I only got 6 hours of sleep, which is also my way of lowering expectations on my time. I'm kind of like Donald Trump. I'm going to try and lower the bar so much that as long as I don't physically attack somebody, I'll be considered the winner of the debate or something like that. So, my little dig. Well, I didn't expect to be the first person. I was hoping there was going to be a buffer between me, the opening of the conference and you having to be subjected to me. So I guess it's my job to basically set the entire tone and frame of the conference, for which I apologize again in advance. As you can see, I'm trying to run the clock out. But I was specifically asked to talk about the so-called military strategic situation in and around the South China Sea. And I have an article, a paper, but I'm probably going to depart a little bit from it because I think there's probably some larger issues that I should treat first. And that is, of course, what we're talking about now is not just simply the South China Sea per se, but I think increasingly we have to link what's happening there with other tangential pieces of water and territory. In particular, and hopefully this is not the situation where all politics are local, but if you're in Singapore, you think a lot about the Singapore Straits, which means you think about the Malacca Straits, which if you use the transitive property, you could start thinking about the Andaman Sea and the Indian Ocean. And of course, indeed, if there's Indo-Pacific in the title of this conference, I think I'm justified in saying that. And the fact that, in a way, we're not just simply talking about the South China Sea, but again, a very important part, which is the Malacca-Singapore Straits, which are, I think, indelibly connected with that. And the point is basically this, is that from a standpoint of trade and strategic situation, and this is obviously a very important part of the international waters of the world. It's obviously, we've heard a lot of the data already in other venues and other papers, is how important this area is for international trade. Some of the statistics are roughly 25% of all the world's trade passes through the Malacca-Singapore Straits and the South China Sea. In particular, most of China's oil energy supplies come through this. In fact, in terms of the really supermax bulk carriers, approximately 50% by dead tonnage weight passes through these waters. And the way that somebody once described it to me, the South China Sea is equivalent in traffic to 3 Suez canals and 5 Panama canals. So this is obviously a very, very important space for much of the world's trade and traffic, particularly between Southeast and Eastern Europe or Eastern Asia and various points west, the Middle East, Africa, and particularly Europe. So we have that aspect of economics. The other side, of course, is that we know that the South China Sea is a very critical area when it comes to natural resources. Oil and gas, of course, always come to mind. But even on a more mundane note, the fish that are caught in the South China Sea feed millions of people around the world, and particularly locally. And in fact, it's estimated that roughly around 60% of the people in Southeast Asia gain their living from some aspect dealing with the South China Sea and maritime issues. So this is obviously very important for economics in that regard too. So therefore, the security of what goes on in the South China Sea and the adjoining waters are very important from that particular economic aspect. But the other thing is, of course, is to keep in point the military strategic. And this is where I think maybe I can add a little bit more to it. Increasingly, you find countries that used to be confined to one ocean or the other, i.e. the Indian or Pacific, are now, in a sense, can't think of a better word at this hour in the morning, are essentially bleeding over into each other's territory. The Chinese, of course, are becoming more present in the Indian Ocean, and the Indian military, particularly the Navy, is increasingly trying to become more active, at least in the South China Sea. So on top of that, of course, you have regional navies of the South China Sea, which probably 30 years ago were essentially the equivalent of McHale's navies, types of coastal patrol boats and the like, and they themselves are gaining the capacity to move beyond so-called brown water or littoral combat, and increasingly becoming more engaged in further out what some people have called green water. Certainly not maybe open ocean, but the idea of becoming more capable or certainly more intentional of being able to project forces further out into regional waters, both for security and for economic reasons. And then, of course, there's the good old United States of America, whose Navy, of course, steams everywhere, has very important naval facilities in Diego Garcia in the southern Indian Ocean, and, of course, is trying to establish itself more and more back in the South China Sea, Southeast Asia in general, through its so-called return or balance or pivot back to Asia. And so, in a certain sense, the South China Sea is sort of becoming like that, really trendy restaurant that everybody has to go to and be seen at. And I think this has been raising, obviously, the profile and the value of this region. And just on a personal note, one of the things I always like to use as a, kind of a point of reference is I first came to Singapore 10 years ago, 2006. And the interesting thing at that time was it was generally assumed, hopefully not wishful thinking, that the South China Sea issue had been solved, that somehow it wasn't important anymore as a security problem because everybody had basically agreed to disagree, that they, and it's part of the so-called code of conduct was the no undercut law and everything. And the idea being therefore that, everybody was going to play nice and not try to make things worse. And indeed, I think that really was the case for a long time. And then roughly in the last 5 years or so, we've seen all that thrown out. Now, where's the blame? Obviously, everybody could probably share a certain amount of responsibility or culpability. But I do think, and I know there's nobody from our earlier speakers not here, so he can't defend himself. But I do think that China, to a large extent, shares a lot of the responsibility for ratcheting up the tensions in the South China Sea. The efforts that they have gone through to essentially try to enforce the ill-defined, indisputable sovereignty that they declare over this region, backed up by increasing military actions, of course, culminated last year at the creation of these constellation of artificial islands, several of which not only have the so-called, the airstrips, but are in fact being reinforced with things like aircraft hangars, radar sites, and perhaps even certain types of weapon systems such as surface-to-air missiles. At the same time that this is going on in the eastern part of the South China Sea, in the western part of the South China Sea, you see the increasing militarization of Hainan and especially Woody Island. And if you go and you look at some of the overhead imagery, which is provided very generously by CSIS out in D.C., you see that Woody Island has seen a pretty dramatic expansion of its military power, including recently the deployment of long-range anti-air missiles, the HQ-9. At the same time, of course, this is being matched by an increasing intransigence and behavior and a certain amount of saber rattling and of course the effort to try and enforce so-called territorial limits around the artificial islands. Not to be outdone, of course, the United States has upped its ante in the region, increased its presence under the so-called freedom of navigation operations. It is being partnered in certain ad hoc cases by other countries, particularly Japan. I understand Australia is also getting involved in this more and more as well. And so to a certain extent, there is a mutual ratcheting up, if not tensions, certainly attention that's being paid to the South China Sea. At the same time, this region is becoming more and more militarized just in terms of, well, military weapons. If we look at the process of arming and counter-arming that's gone on by regional militaries, particularly regional navies and other types of maritime forces, we shouldn't be surprised that we see a lot more offensive-oriented types of weapons that are making their ways into the arsenals of many regional militaries. Obviously, we've seen this in the part of China. China has made tremendous progress in building up particularly its Navy, and in fact, in its most recent white paper, it actually said that the PLA Navy, it will gradually shift its focus from offshore waters defense to a combination of offshore waters defense and open seas protection, an evolutionary development that was first sort of mooted back in around 10 years ago, but seems to be really the wave of the future, which is basically a more expeditionary and a more forwardly oriented PLAN. Of course, we've seen the types of acquisitions that have gone on, particularly culminating in the commissioning of an aircraft carrier by China. Of course, this is obviously, we all know, this is a rather old and used ex-Russian aircraft carrier. But of course, the latest thing we've heard is that they are engaging in a building program. And I don't think it would be surprising to see in 10 years or so the Chinese Navy fielding up to 4 carriers and indeed reorienting its entire Navy around so-called carrier strike groups. So that's something we really have to think about, because that's a major shift away from a submarine-heavy Navy to one that is increasingly more engaged in open and above-surface force projection. On the other side, we see a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, if not directly trying to match the Chinese, which is probably impossible in the first place, but at least trying to make some effort to deal with the growth of Chinese expeditionary military power in the region. And so, of course, one of the things we often hear about is the so-called proliferation of submarines throughout Southeast Asia, and indeed many countries that 20 years ago didn't have submarines, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, are now getting them or have gotten them. Most recently, of course, Thailand has agreed to buy 3 Yuan-class submarines from the Chinese. The Indonesians are in the process of acquiring at least 3 from the Koreans, and most likely want to get more of these. And that's just only part of it. We see a lot of countries which have shifted from essentially coastal-oriented types of patrol boats increasingly to larger and larger ships. In the case of Singapore, for example, the acquisition of 6 frigates, which of course they never possess anything that large. And they're also replacing a lot of their smaller coastal patrol boats with what they call a littoral combat ship, which, not to be confused with the U.S. LCS, of course, but larger ships roughly running around 2,000 tons, which really makes them small frigates. And we see this pattern of acquisition being played out throughout most of Southeast Asia. And of course, at the same time, the Indian Navy is trying to expand and modernize. It's also going nuclear with nuclear submarines. It's also trying to expand its carrier fleet, et cetera, et cetera. And so, and then sort of just on the side. Obviously, what's going on in the air forces is pretty similar. We see the increased acquisition of what we used to call fourth generation or fourth generation plus types of fighter aircrafts, Sukhoi 30s, F-16s, F-15s, Swedish Gripens, etc. And this is a process that has not shown any sign of abating. And probably within 10 years, we'll start to see countries in the region deploying fifth generation fighters like the F-35. Okay. So what's essentially the impact? Well, I try not to let my narrative lead me down this rabbit hole of paranoia and doom and gloom, and I'm sure by the end of this you might be thinking, well, what am I doing here for? But let me put it this way. The arms buildup around the region is significant, and it's matched by the increased attention that we place upon this part of the world. The growth of the South China Sea and the Singapore-Malacca Straits as a strategic choke point, I don't think can be underplayed. In particular, I had a meeting with some people at the U.S. Naval War College a couple of months ago, and they essentially argued that with the Chinese twin buildups in the eastern and western parts of the South China Sea, that they say that essentially China is trying to create a de facto strategic strait out of the South China Sea, something where by the ability to project permanent military presence in the South China Sea, that they essentially create a de facto situation of hegemony in the waters. I don't know if that's exactly true. It sounds pretty credible. Again, depending on your paranoia levels. It's not going to be easy for them to do it, and of course, it's not assured. But one of the things I always like to end with in this case, and I'm sure I'm well over my time, is that what we have seen in the last 20 years with regards to the regional military buildup is not in and of itself worrisome, because weapons are only the extension of policy. But what I also argue is certainly the types of military equipment that regional militaries are getting promises that if there is a conflict, that it'll be very, very different from earlier potential conflicts. It's not going to be guaranteed of being a higher impact, but certainly what we are seeing is the proliferation of capabilities to regional militaries that mean that future conflicts could potentially be much more intense and much more lethal than they were in the past. And so therefore, they may not create the clashes, but they could magnify the intensity of any military clash in the region should they occur. Thank you.